So I'm going to share my screen and put up this version of the presentation. And let me put it on presenter mode. Okay, so yeah, so let's get started. I want to thank you all for making the time. I know everyone's extremely busy and we really appreciate getting a piece of your attention tonight to talk about what we think is a really important issue for Philipstown, and that is developing more walkable and bikeable routes that are safe for people of all ages in our community. So I just want to introduce the Trails Committee before we get started, and we're going to take turns presenting. And then we're hoping that we can just have a nice conversation with the board afterwards and answer any questions that you might have about what we've been doing and what we're proposing. So our committee was formed in January of 2018, and it grew out of the Philipstown Community Congress process. You probably all remember that walkability and bikeability was voted the top community issue in Philipstown, and there were many, many votes by people who wanted to see some thought put to whether or not we could try to reconfigure our community to make it more bikeable and more walkable. So our group came together. We're an all volunteer group of, I would say, dedicated walkers and bikers. That's really the thing that drives people to join this group. And I just have listed the names of the people who have been involved over the years. Everyone has given generously of their time and their expertise, and there's a lot of different expertise as part of this group. I also want to acknowledge Carl Beard of the National Park Service, who has retired, but he was our technical consultant for about 2 years after we obtained a National Park Service technical assistance grant, and he's given us a lot of help. So just very briefly, our mission is to create a walkable and bikeable Philipstown, New York, where pedestrians and bicyclists of all ages, and that's really important to us. We're thinking about children, we're thinking about elderly folks, and everyone in between, where they can safely access important locations, recreational opportunities for the purposes of developing a healthier, more environmentally friendly and socially connected community. Our vision, our big vision, which I'll lay out to you, and then we're going to just talk about a portion of that tonight, is a Philipstown trail that would connect the Cold Spring train station to the Garrison train station. That is our big vision. And then we would like to see offshoots, small trails connecting to important community spaces in between there, like libraries, schools, the rec center, all of the spaces that people in our community enjoy using. But tonight we're just going to talk about a piece of this, and that is just the portion between Cold Spring and Boscobel, because we think that that is probably the portion that a lot of people are most interested in, and it may be the most doable portion of what we're proposing. But ideally, our big vision is a trail that would be both for bicyclists and pedestrians and other non-motorized transport that would connect from Garrison to Cold Spring train stations. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about what we've accomplished so far, our group, since it's come together. Like I said, we received a National Park Service Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Grant to look at feasibility exploration. We hosted 3 Philipstown Bikes Days events in partnership with local businesses and with local municipalities, in which there were about 400 participants. I think everyone who participated really enjoyed having a safe route to be able to bike at least one Saturday a year. And we've also been working with the town's Climate Smart Communities Task Force, because we see we have very overlapping goals. And we worked with Roberto and the town around adopting a complete streets policy, which would also facilitate bikeability and walkability. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen, who will introduce himself and talk about how our idea aligns with some of the other local, state, and federal initiatives.
Thanks, Marianne, and hi, everyone. I just wanted to first introduce myself. Again, my name is Stephen Higashide. I moved to Philipstown and joined this committee just last year. But I was really excited to get involved because my background is in urban planning, and I've worked as a transportation researcher and an advocate for 14 years now. So I'm really, passionate about this issue, and was glad to see how much work has gone into this already. We really see this as a project that meets needs that have been identified by previous town and civic initiatives. As Marianne mentioned, the community Congress process really lifted up safe pathways as a top community priority. And the greenhouse gas emissions inventory report from Climate Smart Philipstown also identified on-road transportation as a really major source of greenhouse gas emissions in the town, fourth largest using the consumption-based inventory. If you use some other measures in the report, it's actually even a bigger priority. If you go to the next slide. Mm-hmm. And it's also really consistent with a lot of the objectives that have been identified in the comprehensive plan. And that draft plan calls for new connections between the community assets here in Philipstown. It calls for safe accommodations on the roadway. And I think we need to keep in mind that in so many cases, it's about accommodating trips that are already happening. And we just see that every day, folks walking in places where currently there isn't the infrastructure for that. And the plan is also around not just ensuring safety, but promoting public health through enabling physical activity. So if we go to the next slide, and it's also really in line with a number of state and regional efforts. The state over a decade ago identified the need for this type of accommodation. The state has also really recognized that multiple transportation options help people get around and also stay socially connected as they get older. And the region has recognized that building a strong economy that doesn't compromise the character of the Hudson Valley, to do that, it requires respecting city, town, and village centers. And one of the ways you do that is by supporting alternatives to the drive alone trip. So next slide. So in a second, I'm going to hand it over to Jason to discuss some of the actual potential routes. But the way this committee has approached the challenge so far has really been with an emphasis on practical options that, whenever possible, leverage existing rights of way, with a focus on walking and biking for people of all ages and abilities, and focusing on connections to local points of interest. And also, just collaborating with institutions, community members, and public officials so that we can build the support that we'll need for this as we go along. With that, I'll hand it over to Jason.
Thank you, Stephen. Good evening, everybody. So I've been a member following Marianne's brave leadership on the Philipstown Trails Committee for the last couple of years. And, I also voted in the Community Congress process for biking and walking as my top priority. So I kind of felt, because of that, guilted into actually joining this group of volunteers. And it's really remained like a pretty stable, like 10 to 15 member committee that has been doing all of this work together over the last few years. And so I guess the only points I'd mentioned before talking about some of the alternatives are that, all of us are aware that this is not the first effort in Philipstown to explore increased biking and walking. And we recognize how, what the challenges are to doing it and how difficult it could be. And because of that, when we got the National Park Service technical assistance grant, they really advised that we put all of the options on the table and that we get creative and not limit the alternatives at all at this point in the process. And so, that meant looking at all of the existing corridors like 9D, which, you know, if anybody's biked knows that you do that and take your own life in your own hands at some points. Looking at Route 9, which is, I think, the official bike lane, but again, it feels like you're playing with your life when you're biking that way. Looking at the Metro North corridor as a possibility, looking at existing dirt roads and how to link those up, and then looking at existing old carriage trails. And, you know, we actually had a fun time finding some old maps of the area and looking at old carriage roads. So if you don't mind, Stephen or Marianne, going on to the next slide. And so just one kind of point of interest is when we're looking at these corridor between Cold Spring and Garrison, it's interesting to note that a majority of properties kind of along the corridor are institutionally owned, which is an advantage. And so that, you know, that includes institutions, you know, land that's owned by Scenic Hudson, the Open Space Institute, Boscobel, Manitou School, St. Basil's, the town, Garrison School, Desmond Fish, and New York State. And so you're looking at a lot of institutional property owners along the route. Next slide, if you don't mind, Marianne. And so let's quickly look at this first stage, as Marianne mentioned. You know, we know it's a long-term process and it's a big vision. And so the committee decided to look at the first stage, linking Cold Spring Village to Boscobel. So we looked at a number of different options. And I think, as you'll see in some of the slides around community support, there's a lot of support already for moving towards linking to Boscobel. You know, both from Boscobel, from Manitou School, from residents in Butterfield, from folks who use the farmers market. And so it kind of makes sense as a stage one of this project. Next slide, please, Marianne.
Yeah.
And I think at this point, Marianne, I'm going to turn it back over to you to discuss some of the community work.
Sure. Thank you, Jason.
Yep.
So these are just some quotes that we've picked up along the way in preparing grant proposals and talking with potential community partners and other supporters. And so Boscobel is very supportive of a mixed use path along 9D that would connect Boscobel to Cold Spring. And they see that as really central to expanding access to their programming and improving the visitor experience so that people could potentially take the train and walk to their site. Let's see. We also have a quote here from Maria Stein-Marison, who's the director of the Manitou School. Manitou School serves over 130 students. Many of them live in Philipstown or Cold Spring. And even though the school is close enough to walk to, it's not safe to walk to. And so there are many car trips that happen because parents have to drive their children to the school. So the school would, of course, like to see a safe walking and biking route that would connect them to the village. We also just want to note that Richard Shea has mentioned the need for a way to connect a biking or walking trail from the village to other outdoor opportunities in the area. And we have a quote here from Michelle Smith, the director of the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, who has been working with us and has helped us to think through some of these issues. And then this is a quote from a resident who lives at Butterfield and would love to be able to walk to the farmer's market and be able to get around. And I know that she represents a lot of people who live in the village of Cold Spring who would welcome the opportunity to be able to walk to Boscobel and to the farmer's market as well. Linking Cold Spring to Boscobel, we see as primarily benefiting local residents and institutions, improving community health, creating safe alternatives. We also have looked into some local data and surveys that report that additional pedestrian and biking options to Boscobel would decrease local traffic and also carbon emissions. And we see it important that trails would be clearly marked so that people know how to safely maneuver on the trails, allowed times of use, etiquette, people cleaning up after themselves. And that clearly identify property boundaries, private property versus trail property. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason, who's going to walk us through the different options that we've all identified at this point.
Thank you, Marianne. So we've actually, you know, I've got to say, this has been it's a great group to be a part of, because we've been doing a lot of exploring over the last few years. And it's one of those things where you don't always know, even if you've lived here your whole life, you know, what's in your backyard. And so we're going to look at three kind of possible options in this stage one linking Cold Spring Village to Boscobel. They were identified as part of this National Park Service technical assistance process. And then I guess I just want to really make clear that because this project is at such an exploratory stage still, that no property owners have been talked to. You know, a large part of this feasibility study would be, you know, in many cases, clearly identifying where property lines are. And so it's very much in an exploratory phase, and all alternatives, you know, should be considered there. So three main options looking at connecting Cold Spring to Boscobel, and we'll talk through each of them and show some photos that various committee members took. Option one is connecting from Cold Spring Metro North Station through Foundry Preserve up onto Route 9D. Option two follows that same pathway, but instead explores an old carriage trailway along Constitution Marsh to Boscobel. And option three goes through the village and connects to Boscobel via Route 9D. So let's just take a closer look at each of those. Thanks, Marianne. So option one, starting from the train station at Cold Spring, but also you would imagine that other linkages, maybe such as Kemble Ave from the village, would also lead into this sort of an option. And so this option's a little bit over 2 miles, and it goes from the train station along this green path, along the existing pathways through the Foundry Preserve, and then takes and then veers towards Route 9D. So let's take a closer look if we go to the next slide. And so this is just a picture. The owner of this property is Scenic Hudson. Again, the site conditions, there's a parking lot, there's existing pathways. And if you go past what is the, on the upper right picture, the old Foundry Park Administration Building, behind there, it links to an old carriage road. And we can take a look at that on the next slide. And so this is where, if you go behind that administration building, there's a carriage road pictured in the upper left-hand side of the screen, which leads up to Route 9D. It is in fairly good shape, as you can see. It's wide. It is fairly steep in sections. So when you're thinking about both biking and walking as a lane, you take that into account. You'll see in these pictures that there's sections of the route where there's some fallen stone walls. And I think part of a feasibility study would help identify where there is one private property owner as it turns towards Gilboa Lane, and it's not clear where those property lines are. And then you get dumped out onto Route 9D. And I think the important thing to note here is that this route kind of puts you onto 9D after the Foundry Brook Bridge. If we don't mind going to the next slide, please. Mm-hmm. And then from that point, you know, you can look at either side of 9D. One is looking at crossing 9D at that point and going along the Manitou School route to potentially the Inverugie Lane. Inverugie Lane, as we understand it, is currently, it's a private road, I believe, but it's maintained by Boscobel. And at that point, when you come out on Inverugie Lane, if you've crossed over, you have to cross back over 9D to get onto Boscobel property. And it's noted that that's a very dangerous crossing. It's along a curve. And so that is, you know, that is a drawback. I guess if you stayed on the other side of 9D at that point, you wouldn't have to cross 9D at all along this route. And at this point, you gain access to Boscobel, and I don't believe we have pictures of it. We walked it with Jennifer. There is an existing grass pathway that's protected between 9D and Boscobel's property that leads onto Boscobel grounds, and you've safely gotten there. So we could go on to the next slide. So option 2, we're starting in the same place. Either, you know, there's access to this trail through points from the village, through the train station. And the only difference is that at that administration building, instead of heading up to 9D, there's an old carriage road that follows Constitution Marsh. If you don't mind, the next slide, Marianne. And so this is at that point. Again, that old carriage road that bends along Constitution Marsh, it's unclear where exact property lines are there. If you walk that portion, there is about a third of the pathway between the old administration building and Boscobel where the carriage road disappears and is kind of bushwhacking. And I think the things to think about along that route are identifying property lines, potential impacts on Constitution Marsh because of how close that carriage road is. But that leads you onto Boscobel grounds. And I guess it's important to note that that route is 1.3 miles, which is shorter than the option 2, which was just over 2 miles. So it's a more direct route to Boscobel. If you don't mind going on to option 3, please. And then option 3 is kind of it's about half the distance. It's less than option 1, but more than option 2 in terms of direct mileage. In this case, you would be walking through the middle of the village by some route, and you would follow the sidewalk until it ends at Downey Oil along Bank Street, and then you would explore the options from there. If you don't mind, the next slide. I think I see intrepid Rebecca Ramirez and John Pavlik and Bruce Kocher, who are doing a lot of this work, doing measurements, taking their lives into their own hands. So this would be extending the sidewalk from Bank Street along Route 9D. There would be a couple options there. One tough one is along the bridge, which would be a shared lane. And as you can see from that picture in the bottom left, there's not very much room on that bridge for pedestrian or bicyclists. Another option could be establishing a pedestrian bridge along Foundry Brook, just to the northeast from there. If we can go on to the next slide. And along that route, if you're traveling to 9D, as Rebecca and John noted, that in some places there's ample room from the road right of way with 11 feet. And in other places, it's very narrow. I think that is all, because I know we want to get into questions. So if we could move on from this slide. I think at this point, so those are some of the options that would be explored in a potential feasibility study. So at this point, I will turn over a discussion of that feasibility study back to Stephen.
Yeah, so you know, as Jason said, there's still some additional fact-finding that needs to happen. I just want to conclude here by talking a little bit about our next steps as a committee and some potential next steps for the town. So there are these additional fact-finding questions that have to be resolved, including the questions of property lines and concerns from private landowners. The committee has solicited a proposal from an area firm, Weston and Sampson, and depending on the scope of that study, you know, the total cost is between $35,000 and about $44,000. And as a committee, we're in the process of seeking funding for that study, talking with potential private and public donors. If you go to the next slide, I think a few other next steps to think about and perhaps talk about in the discussion. You know, we're not asking for the board to make any decisions this evening, but did want to bring up 3 possible action steps that the town could take in support of this effort. The first would simply be providing a letter of support that we could reference in future grant applications, or as we're talking with potential donors for the feasibility study. The second would be, potentially the town could serve as a fiscal sponsor of the feasibility study itself. And the reason why that would make a difference is that, as a committee, we're essentially a group of private citizens, but if the town, or in theory, another municipal or nonprofit partner was willing to be the fiscal sponsor for the study, it makes the study eligible to be funded through additional types of state or federal grant programs, that is not possible to access as a group of private citizens. And finally, ultimately, if the study identifies a feasible route, the most likely way to actually build the trail is through construction grant programs through the State Department of Transportation, and that would require a municipal sponsor. So with that, I think we want to open it up to questions and discussion. We want to thank you for your time. And, I also really want to point out that there are several other members of the committee here besides the three of us who spoke. And I hope folks will feel, willing to jump in as we get into the conversation. So thank you.
Well, I would just say that, a letter of support from the town is obviously, that's an easy thing. Administration of grants, we do a fair amount of that. We're still doing it for the Fjord Trail. So, but that gets busy. But that's a much larger project. So, but it is a fair amount of administration and bookkeeping. But it's definitely something we could talk about. And then sponsoring the grant to build the trail, that would obviously be more complex. For the feasibility study, I don't think it's going to be all that heavy of a lift. So we could definitely do that. And it would be good to have like a board member be the direct liaison to make sure that the correct steps are taken. And when the stuff comes in, they go and talk to the comptroller, and she doesn't feel overly burdened, because again, with the Fjord Trail, it got pretty involved, and there were a lot of, pretty large sums of money. So, and the fact that, we're in 2 capital construction projects right now, that adds a lot of work to her regular responsibilities, which are pretty substantial even on their own. And also, it depends on the time of the year. Right now is audit time. So she doesn't like to hear anything at this time of year, but all 3 of those things definitely be considered.
I think it's exciting too. Thank you for that presentation. And I was wondering, I am a resident of the village, so I have walked that route from the train to the foundry up to 9D. And since 9D is a state road, I was wondering if you started any discussions with anyone at DOT or any of the state officials about that. Or is it just early on, too early for that? I know whenever we consider traffic devices on 9D, we're always told that it is a state road, and the state, has a lot of say in how this develops. So
I'm wondering if Bruce Crawshaw would like to address that, since he has had some conversations with the state's pedestrian liaison.
Happy to do it, Marianne. Just to say that I have had discussions with the person in District 8, which subsumes our section of New York. And she is very supportive. She's on the alternative routing side of transportation, not roads, but others. And she is definitely interested in our project.
Great.
To the ones that were presenting, I just want you to know there were some questions that that arrived while you were making the presentation that were not answered. So I was just going to go through them before we take any additional questions. One question from Liz Corio was, would an elevation plan be something that would be part of the feasibility study? That's part one of the question.
Yeah, I think that both, I saw that question about elevation and about inundation. So kind of maybe both of those at the same time. I think that a feasibility study would both look at, I mean, the purpose of the feasibility study would be to, it's the step that would occur obviously before any funding for any actual building or development. It's looking at the feasibility of different options. And so it would look at elevation, inundation, and it would explore how those would affect the feasibility of different routes, as I understand it.
Jason, would that also include the second portion of Liz's question? It says, how does option 2 route hold up with any inland marsh migration? That's also something we can't answer at this time, right?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think that you would have to look at that as part of a feasibility process. Don't you think, Stephen? Or that would all kind of be included in a feasibility process, which may eliminate some routes,
Yeah, in the feasibility studies that we've been involved with, and there've been quite a few, generally they do a ranking. They don't eliminate anything. They'll do a ranked system saying, the most preferable, least preferable. So that's how they arrived. That's how they'll arrive at a route. And sometimes it's a combination of the, whatever the alternatives are. But that's how they arrive at the route for the fjord trail from Cold Spring to Beacon.
Mm-hmm.
Jason, well, first of all, I'd say thank you to all you guys for the great presentation. You all put a lot of work into this, that's for sure. And the feasibility study, I would obviously rank it, but I'm sure you guys must have one that you prefer, being out there and seeing the different routes. I'm sure there's one that you guys all prefer.
Honestly, I guess I jump in and say that I personally do not have a preference. I would like to see the most feasible. I mean, that's why I think we need the study, because we weren't able to come up with all the answers from our exploration and with the expertise that we have. So we'd like some, engineers to weigh in on what is feasible, how much would it cost. But I think the point that Celia Barber has made in the chat is also a good one, that a piece of that feasibility study should look at the extent to which any of the proposed alternatives would fit into the larger vision. I think that that's a really good point that she's made.
Okay.
I would agree with Marianne. I think we all enjoyed walking the routes and exploring what's there, what could possibly come from what's already existing. But I feel like there's just not enough facts to, for me anyway, as a committee member, not enough facts to make me feel, all of the different routes have strengths and challenges.
Kathleen has her Foley.
Hi, this is fantastic and super exciting. One of the things I think about with trails that I've been on in other communities is the ability to pause and engage with other people on the trail, and the creation of sort of single serving social events, right, that happen along these trails. And that's going to be hard on the Route 9. On the Route 9, if Route 9 were to be included as part of that, because of that, the bridge, as the photo of Rebecca showed, the narrow roadway is really challenging. But I think they are all viable routes and all have pros and cons, and it's worth looking at all of them. But I would just sort of make a plug for the opportunity for relaxed and more free-flowing interactions on a pathway.
I guess I have a question to this group. So, one of the things, Richard, is to your point about us learning more about how the town, if they apply, if they administered and applied for the grant, how it affects the town, you know, and what that means for the town from an administrative or point of view. Because, you know, as we've all talked about from our committee perspective, you know, in terms of putting together, you know, being able to be a resource to put together grants and applications for feasibility studies and applications to seek funding. I mean, that's part of what I think we hope to do as a committee. But, you know, and as Stephen pointed out, you know, when it gets to construction development, a town asking for the funds makes a lot more sense. But from your point of view, it comes with things that we probably don't realize in terms of the administration of those funds and grants.
It's like any construction project. You have to set up a segregated account, and those accounts have to be audited. And then there's the whole, you know, the whole bit with invoicing, and then checking invoices, making sure invoices get paid, making sure invoices are, you know, it's a whole filing system that is involved in that to make sure that, because with town hall, you know, we get so many invoices and we review a lot of them, and then we make changes to them, so they go back out for review, then they come back. There's a lot of back and forth. It's rare that we get an invoice and it's 100% correct and we just pay it outright. There's a, you know, a real large amount of review on these things, and it's, again, I said, it's rare for them to be paid on the first round. So there can be some confusion at times as to, you need a point person to assist the comptroller, because, you know, again, her job is busy as it stands. And when you start adding in these things, and you know, we're going to move right out of the town hall project into the highway department project. So that takes up a lot. And as you said, we're still working on the Fjord Trail project. And, you know, if you start stacking a lot of that stuff up, suddenly it becomes a job unto itself. So, you know, the town can do it, but the more assistance there is from a group, the better off. Or just having a point person saying, you know, here's the grant, here's the check, here's the invoice, here's what needs to be paid, you know, sort of becoming the sidewalk superintendent for the project.
Thanks.
I just had one observation. Well, two things. You know, Kathleen's point about Route 90, but, you know, don't aim low, because who's to say that there couldn't be a pedestrian walkway attached to that bridge? And there was another bridge just to north of that. The original bridge was north of that, and the abutments are still there. I don't know how stable they are, but these are all engineering solutions. So, you know, for laymen to say, well, that doesn't look possible, but, you know, that was one of the big things to get over with the Fjord Trail. There were some pretty incredible engineering challenges. And, you know, at this point, they're talking about building a pedestrian walkway over the railroad at Breakneck. So those are big things, but big things can still be done. So.
Thank you for the encouragement. We actually found those footings when we were out exploring, and thought the same thing as you. It's possible that, you know, if those things are structurally sound, perhaps you could use them.
Right, because the requirements for a pedestrian bridge are much, much lower than for a vehicular bridge.
I see Jeff Mickelson has his hand up.
Yes, hello. Jeff Michelson, and thanks for that awesome, yeah, no problem. Thanks for that awesome presentation. So I'm speaking tonight, I guess, in my capacity as the new advocacy chair for the Chamber of Commerce. And we've discussed it in the advocacy committee and with the board, and we'd like to voice our full-throated support for the mission and the vision of the Trails Committee. And, you know, to confirm that it would be a great thing, not just for the community, but specifically for the business community of Philipstown, not just because Boscobel and the farmers market are both members of the chamber, but because making Philipstown more walkable and bikeable is in the interest of local businesses throughout Philipstown, and especially on Main Street. I know a lot of folks down there would like for it to be easier for people to walk and bike to those businesses. I guess the second capacity that I'm speaking in is as a resident who walks regularly to the farmer's market from Cold Spring, and can confirm it is quite a harrowing walk at points. And so it serves a very important purpose. And, you know, again, just speaking on as a resident in that capacity, you know, I'd express an interest for the second option, not only because it's shorter, but because it wouldn't involve crossing 9D. It's, you know, probably the most harrowing part of that walk or the bike is the bridge, but second to that is the second crossing, as you pointed out, Jason, closer to Basketball. And, you know, you have cars screaming down that road and it's coming around a turn. And so any way to avoid that, I think, would be much safer and again, make for a much more pleasant walk. So thanks again for all your hard work on this. This is just an amazing presentation. Thanks.
Jeff, this is Bruce. Thank you very much for that. I've got a 30-second anecdote to back up what you just said. My wife and I were out making the photographs and doing measurements along 9D, and a state trooper pulls up, puts on his lights, stops in the middle of the road and said, "What are you doing here?" And we explained that we're doing measurements and trying to figure out how to do this. And he said, "Get off this, it's unsafe." That's the end of my anecdote.
Yeah, Bruce, we were on that too. It was very scary measuring, you know, taking the measuring tape every 25 to 50 feet to see how much room there was for one body along 9D. I was going to add a couple of things. You know, I think what's really exciting about working on this this visioning and for this possibility is that we were looking. Three of us were asked to take a look at data that already exists that would support, you know, this taking place.